pressure there. Well, I'm gonna actually go through quite a few slides, and instead of going into something deep, I think I'll go a little bit fast. So I've read the book. I'm gonna highly recommend it, and I've read like hundreds of books now on this subject with the PhD, and I also want to, maybe it's justify the PhD. The PhD is a practice-based PhD from the University of Ulster, and started off as just responding to my work in Portadown. So sometimes I feel a little bit fraud in academia, but read all the books. And just to speak to this book, there's so many things that really resonated with me in terms of it. It's a memoir, but it really is an informed memoir of a practice that has been strongly based in one place. And I think it's a fantastic introduction. So, I'm taking at least 5, maybe 10 back to motto. As you can tell, I'm American, but I've lived in the north of Ireland for 8 years and then spent time back in America for 5 years. But one of the things that I really wanted to look at, and at least for my most recent work and my practice for about the past 10 years, came directly out of work in Portadown, which the top photograph is really important point in the history of Portadown, one of the bombs that leveled a good section of the community in the town center. And it was out of that, those kind of ashes and the traces of sectarianism, Millennium Court Art Center was established. And I had come from a background of museums, including some pretty big ones in the States, including like the Met and the Walker. And I got into Portadown, and I found that some of that same framework didn't work. And more importantly, I wasn't really that interested in it anymore. But luckily, I married this Irish guy from West Belfast, and he very clearly said, before you start getting politically involved and politically active, why don't you just listen? Why don't you and listen? And coming from an Irish American background, which is clearly on one side of many Irish Americans are clearly on one side of the issue in the north. Going into a place like Portadown, which is just barely predominantly Protestant, but has very much a Protestant history. It was a really surprising experience when I did close my mouth and stop talking and start listening, that my friends were not who I would have thought they would have been. That was pretty shocking. That the people who really wanted to support the town re-emerging and growing ended up being people who I didn't think I had a lot in common. So I kind of want to herald that out, that I think when you start to listen and learn, you really realize who your potential allies can be, instead of presuming who they might be. So I wanted to ask some more meaningful questions, instead of being a curator who threw stuff up on a wall or presented it on a plinth. I wanted to do something and say something, and I wanted to respond to the context of what was happening there. So I came up with this framework a little bit later, but within about the first year of my research, which started about 8 years ago, but called Slow Curating. And the sites are Portadown, Atlanta, Georgia, LaGrange, Georgia, and Fargo. I came up with this framework which just helped me understand what I was doing, because we had spent 8 years in Portadown doing this kind of work, listening, following my instincts, working collaboratively, again, listening. So a lot of the things that Fiona has talked about, being reflective, I didn't look for answers. I mainly asked more questions in my exhibitions, evolving knowledge and meaning, self-criticality, constantly learning, constantly being open to that learning from others. So it became kind of a process of collaboration and a reciprocal collaboration. That isn't just, let's get together and collaborate. There's a lot of that speak in my world. We need to collaborate. Let's get some synergy. But actually working through concrete projects in a way that's reciprocal and respectful, with open-ended processes, working in context, and utilizing innovative approaches and methods. And maybe some of you have more of a background or knowledge around curatorial practice, but this isn't normal curatorial practice, just in case you are not sure, because the curatorial practice that has been developed historically has been from the museum sector and has an art history background. The more recent, probably 25 years, is more of a DAPL or a BARD kind of, BARD, those are two universities that turn out curators, which were conceptually based. So none of that worked for me. I tried it. I kind of tried on the sweater. It did not fit. That didn't fit at all with me. And that's another part of what, if I call my curatorial work my practice, it's based on who I am, my interests. It's, so it's not kind of a knowledge or a skills base that I inherit, that I made up or that I embraced more than I just actually allowed myself to have this kind of practice. I don't know if that makes sense. But anyway, this is a long quote, but basically this is Olga Wiesel, the director at the Walker Art Center, and there's a great quote by Michael Govan, and what they basically are saying is that museums and gallery spaces need to change. There is a new structure that has to be employed. Artists need to are no longer simply the producers of art, like their counterparts in the late 19th century who helped found many of the museums. Artists have been invited inside the museum to help shape programs, to interpret their own work, and as well as others to serve as provocateurs. I like that word. But what my work has been is really about reimagining what a museum, what an institution, what a gallery space, what a curator, what an artist does, what an educationalist does, and really messing with those ideas. So this didn't come out of anywhere either. The important for me is to describe the lineage of social practice from Alan Kaprow and Meryl Lederman Kayleys, Yoko Ono, Joseph Beuys. There's a legacy of artists who have been doing this kind of work. When I found most of the socially engaged artists or socially, politically engaged artists have come out of is a time when there has been a shift in what's happening in the world, right? Big surprise. We respond to what's happening in the world. And the last couple of shifts that have happened, and that I can see where artists have really begun to take this up, are around the world wars or when there's been major kind of economic changes. So, big surprise, most recently in the past 10 to 15, 20 years, we've had a pretty serious economic crisis, and people are much more interested in this social practice. And I only point this out because, at least in the United States too, there's a lot of discussion like, where did this come from? Why is socially engaged art so popular now? And I'm like, it isn't. We have a legacy. We came from somewhere, and we're part of something a little bit bigger. So, what I wanted to do was to start rethinking what a space could be. And I put up these two pieces, these two shows, because they were the beginning of the potential of what I could see, and the staff and I could see as the potential for changing and altering people's perceptions about Portadown, about contemporary art, and about people in themselves. This is Alice Maher's portrait series, you probably know it. When it showed in Portadown, which is, I'm trying to think of, is it like Tuam? Is it like Tuam, about the size of, anyway, it's a small town, Portadown. When people first saw it, they thought, they liked it, they hated it, and wasn't really concerned if people liked it or hated it. I mean, I wanted people to have a discussion around it. And similarly with Shane Cullen's The Good Friday Agreement, the agreement piece that came to Portadown as well, we were afraid that people would like it, wouldn't hate it. But what these both proved was that the gallery space could become a site of dialogue and discussion. That, I don't know about actually having major social change, but on a small scale, the Maher portrait show, we showed it, and 4 years later, I walked into a shop on the high street in Portadown, and someone said, "Oh, are you from London Port?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "I remember that show with the one with the dead things around her neck." I was like, "Yeah." I know what that's about. 4 years later, what do you think it's about? She was a vegetarian. And I said, I have no idea if Alice is a vegetarian or not. Maybe, and probably, and yes, and no. And it wasn't even really the answer. It was the fact that she was still talking about it 4 years later. I don't know if that's impact. I don't know if that's change. But I know that it's getting people to actually engage with contemporary practice. On the other hand, one of the big things that has changed, and I'll talk about another one with an exhibition with the Orange Order, during the Shane Cullen show, remember Mid-Ulster, where Portadown is, voted against the Good Friday Agreement in its majority. So I had to have a risk assessment. I had to know bombs. I had a plan for everything. And when this show went up, and guess what? This will happen again. Nothing happened. No protest. No Ian Paisley. Nothing. So, but what did happen was that we asked all of the political parties in the north of Ireland to come to Portadown and present their, what was then embryonic cultural platform. And they all came, and they all did okay, but they've all said that it has informed, I mean, they had to begin thinking about their cultural program at that point. We'll come back to that. This is another case in point. This is Seeing Orange in Orange Segments. This is an exhibition we had in Portadown looking at working alongside and community curating with the local Orange Lodge number 1. Portadown is notorious for being the center of, or the birthplace of Orangism. And that was an interesting, concept to kind of embrace. And one of the other things that Fiona talked about was, I read, was kind of leaning into that difficulty or addressing the difficulties rather than ignoring them. I'm very conscious too that I was able to do some of this because I was an American. I mean, at one point they said, "Are you a Catholic American? Are you Catholic?" I said, "I'm an atheist." They said, "Catholic atheist or Protestant?" So I'm aware of that, but we used that, we utilized that in a way to really look at these issues. And so we worked along with the Orange Order to do an exhibition on the artifacts and the material culture of the Orange Order. And then we had a contemporary artist take on imagery in the Orange Order in the larger gallery space. And then we hosted, the first time ever, a public discussion with members of the Orange Order on a discussion about Orangism and the Orange family as is it a culture, is it a subculture, is it a metaculture, is it a culture? So it was, again, one of the first and is now often pointed to as an example of how art can be utilized as a space for dialogue, particularly in the North. I'm going to keep going. That was just a failure, by the way. I like to always point out my failures. Wanted to experiment with mediation and thought we'd do an iPod tour, and didn't work because people didn't want to put earplugs in somebody else's earplugs in their ears. So we had that whole, you hand out their iPod tours. Yeah, that didn't work. So another mediation. I'm going to go on. This is a project that we worked on with, how are you doing on time? This is Andre Stitt, who is originally from Belfast and currently works in Wales, and his practice was primarily performance-based. We asked him to come to Portadown and respond in some way. And this is the framework that I've used for a long time and continue to use. In fact, we hope maybe Fiona, if you're looking to go west, maybe we can convince you to come to the model. But the idea was that we invited Andre to come, and he toured around worked with us, hung out at the Millennium Court for a while, met with people, stayed in the area, and became really interested in some of the ideas around Craigavon, which is a utopian settlement, quite like Milton Keynes' made-up city in the middle of Craigavon in South Ulster. So what he began to do is unpack and do a series of interviews and discussions, and was based in Millennium Court for over a year and a half, and worked with local people and the Millennium Court Art Center staff, many of whom lived in Craigavon. So Craigavon was this made-up town in the late 60s, early 70s. Urban designers decided to set up a town. They have a ski jump, they have a skiing hill, they have a mall, they have these roundabouts. But what happened was the economic crisis happened in the north and the Troubles, and it became what's known as Little Beirut. So it burst. There was a boom, and then it bust, and then now it was booming again at this point. So we're looking at kind of the legacy and traces of, and asking questions about power, powerlessness, class, sectarianism, and boundaries in landscape. This is the Gorilla Girls project that we worked on with NCAD when Declan got was first in NCAD, the University of Ulster, Cork, the Glucksman in Cork, Kilkenny. And what we had conceived of as a project that would look at sexism and power and powerlessness within the art world, particularly in Ireland, we invited the Girls to come and create a new body of work. And this was kind of twofold. The artists have done this before. They come in and they do a series of gigs and meet with people and do oral archiving and talk interviews and collect data information. On the same side, we also had a team based here that worked on collecting data and information, collecting how many students were at each of the schools, how many were getting solo shows. We looked at all of the awards. We looked at representation, et cetera, and we found a series of, we just collected statistics, basically. And the Girls created 2 new bodies of work. And I remember having a conversation around, we had a steering committee of all of those, the previous organizations and institutions. And the idea was that we would come together as equals. We commissioned it together. Glencore took the lead, but we decided sometimes with difficulty and sometimes with great ease about decisions about how the project would be manifested. And I remember one time Declan particularly asking, what's the output? What's the final output? What is it going to look like? How are we going to know it's good? Was the other, didn't quite say it in that kind of words, but I think what we came out of was this idea that it was about the process, not about the object in the end. And for me, this is where most of my interest, where the final break happened, I guess, where I became less interested particularly in just the output of a project that was socially engaged and more about the process. Because in the end it was, they were cool and it toured and there were dialogues and there were discussions and it changed. I mean, we did have people say it changed their life to meet the girls and do workshops with them and talk with them. But it was really about this process that had somewhat to do with the girls, but not that much to do with the end product. It was just a means to an end, in a way. These are some of the other projects. I then went to Georgia and worked in LaGrange. And LaGrange is, you can kind of see the LaGrange Art Museum down there. The LaGrange Art Museum is a building from 1892. It was built at first as a jail. This is the Deep South. It's a half an hour away from Alabama and an hour outside of Atlanta. And about 50 years behind, I would say, maybe. In terms of people, I mean, very sophisticated on one level, but also at the same time really quite still a little bit conservative in terms of their positions in terms of art and politics, and Tea Party had a very strong hold on the town, and those were people who were on my board. And very much like Portadown, I didn't see it so much as a problem, but as something that we would begin to engage with. And I say this very carefully in a way, but also to be very honest, it was very different politics than mine. But that didn't really matter in a way, because it was what we were trying to accomplish was about opening up space, not closing down space. And this jail is very much a contested site. As I said, it was a county jail in 1892. It had different iterations, but there were seven people hung in the site, 6 of whom were African American. LaGrange didn't desegregate unofficially. Officially it did with desegregation, the end of the late 60s, but until 1982, I think. And really probably more closer to 2002, when they stopped, the city stopped saying, we'll build a swimming pool on this side of the tracks, and then we'll build a swimming pool on this side of the tracks. So within that context, we began to look at inviting artists to come again, but also about looking at issues around collective assets and what do we have within the institution ourselves. And we looked at working within our community to gather together what we could do together more than we could do on our own. This is a project by Mark Clare, who's an Irish artist who's actually in the model right now. I didn't know him when I was in LaGrange, but he was this Irish guy that I was down in Columbus and said, hey, we should do a project, and I said, great. he came up with this idea of working, after being in LaGrange, Georgia, and being in Georgia for over a year, he had come up with this idea around building a temporary sculpture based on the grounds of the museum. And the context in which this is happening, this is a sculpture garden in the back of the sculpture garden with a temporary space, or temporary sculpture, 100 feet away, which you can see just beyond those lights in the far right-hand corner, is this town square in which General Lafayette sits on top of a bronze statue of Lafayette on top of a horse. So the dialogue became, I'm doing a little bit shorthand here, but the dialogue became about what is public art, what role does it play. There were issues, public discussions and dialogues around the housing market, regional vernacular and architecture. The project was made over a period of about a month, working with local students, art students, a couple of the guys from around town who call this space their space, which is it is their space. It's where they sleep at night, and some of the housing executive workers. And it became, again, a shared space where we were sharing stories, discussions, and this is another project that I then moved to Fargo, North Dakota, and one of the projects that we looked at was looking again at the museum. This was a democratic approach to a museum, in which there was an online vote for the exhibition, for the most popular works in the collection. And then we had a set of community curators who curated the show. My role there as a curator was intentionally inverted and subverted to take notes and to implement what the community curators had wanted to do. And what they had particularly wanted to do was break every curatorial rule I've ever learned, both in school and out of school, which was really fantastic. In fact, Real Clear Arts hated this concept and called us out on it. Real Clear Arts is a blog from New York, and they said that we had denigrated the curatorial profession. And luckily, there was a marketing guy working with us, because my response was like, yes, we are actually. We're really trying to do this. But we wanted to also really respond to our community and what they wanted to see at the museum, but do it through a way that was informed and as broad as possible, really intentionally kind of messing with a lot of the infrastructure. Again, another slight failure. When I was asked to come to Fargo and work on these kind of socially engaged curatorial projects, I said, this is great. There's an annual flooding every year in Fargo, and there's always this it's horrific, and it's kind of crazy because it happens every year, and there's diversion plan now, but and thousands, hundreds of thousands of people come out to help save the city every single year. And it's kind of this rite of passage for students, and but it's a horrific, very dangerous, very volatile situation. And I said, it would be really amazing to have artists come and respond to this, the situation and the idea, and work with artists that are locally who are interested in talking about some of the ideas in flooding and annual funding and community and what that meant. And so we made a call, if you're interested in utilizing creative ideas to make a difference in our community, we want to look at interruptions, initiatives, again, very open-ended. In terms of my curatorial practice, I usually just ask artists to come and respond in some way, and we facilitate and produce what the artists want to do. So, guess what happened? There's an annual flooding, but that year there was no flood. So that kind of sucked. But it was really great, too, in a way, because we then began to say, okay, what does this mean? And strangely enough, it came quite close to some of the issues in terms of post-conflict in the North, post-racism, and alleged post-racism, alleged post-conflict in the North and in the South, in terms of what does it mean when there's this after effect of tension, of what do you do when there's a release? What do you do when you're not thinking about it? What are the issues that come in that kind of post-time frame? So we did a lot of archiving, collecting stories, performative work, collaborations with universities and students. Stevie Famulari created a series of seed bags which carried the idea of growth and rebirth handed out hundreds of those. Rebecca Cranky collected flood stories. This is a dike on the right-hand side where that's one of the dikes that's holds back the water. But again, giving voice, I don't know, giving voice to people who wanted to tell their stories about the flood and unpack the ideas a little bit. This is a project along with that, Jeff Knight handing out 200 wishbones, hand-carved wishbones to all the workers, the flood workers in Fargo. Obviously wanting to break it because it's a wishbone, not wanting to break it because it's an artwork. And then a propaganda. We work with students in a project called Engage You at NDSU to propagate this idea of, well, what will we do for our community now that there is no flood? And to give you you could actually, with the amount of sandbags that are used to stop the flood every year, you could twice go over the Egyptian pyramids with that many. It was a lot of hours. Last example I'll use is, this is Luis Jimenez. One of the things that I was asked when I was interviewing at the Motto was, how will you, a lot of the artists that you want to work with are not necessarily socially engaged artists. And I said, yes, that's right, I'm really interested and excited about lots of artists. But how will you employ your practice? And I said, because it's a socially engaged curatorial practice, it's an institutional practice that is employed, or attempts to be employed. So Luis Jimenez is now deceased, but he is one of the most important Latino artists in America, and this is one of his first public sculptures of a sod buster. And this was on view in Fargo for 2 decades, but it had been taken off because of it had been kind of dissolving in the snow and the sleet and the salt. But it was one of the most important questions asked in Fargo. Where is sodbuster? What have you done with it? What's going to happen? And so we held a series of public discussions. We asked for people's questions. We had people voting where they might be. And riffing off of some of the people that I admire quite a bit, Annie Fletcher and Charles Esche at the Van Abbe Museum in the Netherlands, we pulled out archival information and showed the public what hadn't been showed before. Really trying to underscore this idea that sodbusters is the public's and we hold it in trust, and what would you like to do with it, and that informed our work. There's a couple other examples of my alternative blockbuster Warhol show. That's it. Thanks.